All right, hi, this is Richard from Agri-Futures, and I'm joined here by Professor Stephen Kelly, who's the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Massey University Business School. So thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and the opportunities of developing regenerative type businesses in New Zealand, and in particular in the agricultural sector. So just to start, perhaps just to frame up the conversation a little bit, in Agri-Futures we've got a permaculture design course, so that's all about how you can create a regenerative farm type system. And I've been very interested in how you can take those concepts of permaculture and apply it to business, so how you can create that functional diversity within, how you can replicate that functional diversity on a farm and transfer it to a business. So how can you start to look at a business and the elements within that business and get them collaborating together in ways that will improve the health and resiliency of that business as a consequence of production within that business. So if that business is producing some output, everything's kind of organised and the strategy of that business is organised so that there's going to be regenerative outcomes as a consequence of production. So it's kind of delving into that story and what are the challenges of doing that, and how can we start to move perhaps in that direction. So perhaps to start that conversation, look at what are the kind of the opportunities of New Zealand businesses. So what kind of niche do we internationally occupy, that what strategic advantage do we have internationally that we can start to better position ourselves in? And is there alignment with that concept of regenerative outcomes within a business? Is that something that we could start to look at developing more within businesses? And if that is an opportunity, what kind of challenges would there be in doing that? And how can we apply different strategies to perhaps progressing that and making it more effective?
Look, I don't think there is any particular strategic niche that New Zealand occupies. If you look at all the different industries that operate out of here, they've all got their own way of operating, and a lot of that's linked back to the global market. So if you talk about agriculture, for example, obviously pastoral farming is what we're known best for around the world, and that has an element of that clean green image which people like being sold to the world. By the same token, while people around the world will pay a premium for New Zealand produce at this point in time, that premium is limited by their ability to pay. So yes, people appreciate it and people will work to it, but that still has to be done profitably, and that's really challenging at the moment, particularly when New Zealand's so far away. The cost of transportation of any produce from New Zealand to the rest of the world is a major add-on to whatever you do locally. Then if you look at the technology sector, lots of people come up with brilliant ideas for their particular niche, but huge issues around capital. So many of them go offshore to find capital. The moment they go offshore to find capital, they usually have to go offshore to commercialise at the same time. So we've got lots of companies that start up, get to a particular level, and then move offshore because that's where the market is. But more importantly, that's where the capital is. You're not going to find $20 or $30 million New Zealand to take a company to that next level. You'll find 2 or 3 for seed funding, but that's only a starting point.
Okay. Maybe just in particular in the agricultural sector, so you're mentioning that clean green image that we have overseas, and some of the limitations of production, and the cost the overseas markets are willing to pay for that. But I'm wondering, as other markets start to develop internationally that could better compete with us on those kind of primary production levels, is that going to likely perhaps change the nature of our production? Like we perhaps need to start targeting more high-end, nutrient-dense, organic type food production that is a higher quality than other places around the world can perhaps produce more cheaply than us, but not at such a good quality?
Yeah, I think so, but I don't know to what extent that's possible. For example, I would generally look at the Europeans more than the Americans, or the Israelis perhaps is a very good example too, where they are creating in a lot of their farms now, or their farming communities, really small ecological footprints, while being incredibly intense with the farming and how they do it. Very controlled environments, very safe environments, very limited impact, really high output. In many ways it's the ideal. because it does have such a small footprint. The way we currently farm arguably has a much larger footprint. Are we going to have to go down the European way? I really don't know.
What has been some of the ways that they've been able to achieve that low footprint with high outcome production? What have been their strategies?
Yeah, well, really heavy investment to begin with. So if you look at growers, particularly in Europe, the financial investment to create highly intensive but very small footprint farming has been something that you've seen develop there. So the farming companies, more than farming families, are very large entities now. They bring millions and millions of dollars to a particular project. And we do have some very large family farmers, but relatively they haven't got that kind of capital available to them. Now, at the moment, I guess dairy is a good example. I don't understand it well, but dairy farmers have been able to invest quite heavily because of the value of their property and that surety of return over time. So it's a fairly safe industry.
So is it more the organisational structure that has been the advantage overseas, and that the producers have been able to collaborate more effectively to raise finance to be able to produce those production systems in a way that's more effective than what we were able to here, because production is more individualistic? They haven't been able to collaborate more so effectively?
Yeah, we've very much developed here that cooperative model through the big cooperatives. There's any number of them here. They work in a whole range of different ways, but I'd imagine if the figures I've seen are right, if you look at the average farm in New Zealand, it's still a family-owned entity, quite agile, doing the job really well, finding capital from whatever sources they can find capital, very often tied back to a large cooperative. If you look at the model in the US or you look at the model in Europe, these are large corporations raising tens of millions of dollars from capital markets and investing really heavily within their own operation. I don't see our farms generally having that opportunity available to them. So the question is there agility, their ability to adapt to the fact that they are still farming in a more traditional way, an advantage in the international market? There's a part of me that would like to say, I wish it is, but I'm not convinced.
Is that advantage that the overseas cooperatives have is just they're positioned in a bigger market, so they've got more ability to access a bigger population, to reinvest that money back into the businesses that supply them?
Yeah, partially, but if we talk about a large dairy farm here, we're talking about 4,000 head, roughly. If we talk about a large dairy farm in the US, we're talking about 40,000 head.
The scale.
Yeah, scale is so different.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting challenge for us. How do we actually, and maybe the market will just make it happen, I don't know. How do we recreate or create an environment in New Zealand where people can produce with a relatively small footprint at a quality and a price which is acceptable to the international market, given we export, 90% of what we produce?
And is there, that's the point I was going to raise, so is there opportunity to work within the context of those overseas market more to be able to replicate what they do? So to kind of step outside the local context of production and financial systems, and to be able to work more in alignment with what's happening in those European markets, and to be able to set up operations in those contexts so that we're not so disadvantaged here, where we're able to better use some of those advantages of scale and funnel it back into production on this side.
You would hope so. And why I say you would hope so, a lot of it comes down to ownership and structures. So, for example, one of the things we've done here, and we've done it for a whole range of good reasons, and I wouldn't choose to argue against it. We've made it very difficult for international investors to buy up large parts of New Zealand farming community. Why have we done that? Protect local interests, protect local farmers, protect local communities. But in terms of how do you replicate what they've done over there here, That's really the major mechanism that will bring the money in.
So farm ownership's quite a big part of how those operations are set up.
Farm ownership,
Or land ownership.
land ownership structures, how they all come together. Really big part of it.
And you can't replicate that in the context of just ownership of that business. So they have shares in the business and they, invested in the operation of that business as just land ownership and capital investment ownership just being quite a big part of how those businesses are set up.
Well, arguably, again, here we've got the cooperative structure, which is quite sophisticated, and that should, if anything, should facilitate a different model to operate here and lead to that level of investment. That probably should, but it doesn't seem to in the same way. Again, not close enough to the industry, but it is still largely independent farmers who are a member of a cooperative selling to a large central entity that provides advice and guidance and access to finance, but always at a level. It's a really challenging one for New Zealand to know which way you want to go. Look, I would imagine for most New Zealanders, if for example, you were to say we're going to allow an American or European operation to come into New Zealand, buy up half a man or two for a large operation, there's no way the country would accept it. So you've got that real tension there about what should they do, what can they do, what's possible, what's acceptable.
So what will be so in the local context where we're limited in a way to have that investment to be able to lower the footprint in production, so our production's got a bigger footprint, a bigger impact on the environment, what other approaches might there be to adopt other than that kind of corporate structure and the investment of finances? Is there other things like technology or?
I think technology certainly is a part of the answer. But again, if you think about how technology can be adopted by farmers and growers, for example, individual farmers and growers can certainly collaborate and work together to buy in technology. But at the end of the day, it'll be the individual farm and the individual farm owner who will take ownership or control or decision making about what technology they engage and how they use it. So I fear that's just a limiting factor to the whole thing. And I would never want to argue that a large corporate structure is the answer, because I don't think it is.
That's more the ability to collaborate and scale up production and have that investment.
Yeah, because the cooperative model doesn't do that yet. The independent nature of farmers and growers, who don't necessarily want to have all their decision making taken away. They still want to work within their farming environment.
Is there opportunity with the growth of iwi-led businesses and perhaps the better collaboration between those businesses? Is there perhaps more opportunity to tie in with that as a way to kind of create scale and cohesion between different producers under a wider banner that helps kind of bring people together?
Yeah, I honestly don't know. While there's a number of large iwi businesses, particularly in the farming area, which are coming together and have got vast resources and operated very professionally, whether the scale and again access to resources is such to allow that to operate at a scale equivalent to what we find in the rest of the world, I don't know. And then would other farmers and growers from around those regions be able to collaborate and cooperate? We haven't proven that yet. That's probably what I'm saying. It's an unproven commodity.
But some structure like that will give the ability to create more collaboration between producers and be able to scale and to be able to better challenge those European markets, which are the kind of markets that we're best trying to target, would you say? Like that higher value, higher quality market, rather than trying to compete at the current markets that we are?
Yeah, no, look, given the relative size of the European market, I think that and the protection around the European market, it's really tough for us to play in. It really is the growth markets of China and India, and potentially parts of Southeast Asia. And if you want to be very creative in the future, potentially Africa as well. So, China, of course, is the largest single population in the world, incredibly wealthy, doing a huge number of things to try to reduce pollution and impact within their own country. People in China are very, very concerned about food safety, so they look at New Zealand in a very positive way. So that is a market with both the most potential and the most demand. At the same time, if you go to China right now, there is probably billions of dollars being invested in highly intensive agriculture of the type that you see in Europe, you see in the US. So they're very quickly going down that path as well. In the same way they introduced fast-speed trains all over the country very quickly. There is nothing to stop the Chinese from developing really high-quality intensive farming practices with a small ecological footprint in 2 or 3 years.
And is there opportunity to kind of work in collaboration with what's happening in those emerging markets? So, and to kind of position New Zealand in partnership with them in a way that will kind of build better future business opportunities and try to avoid being shut out of the markets like what's happening in European and
I think there is, and going back to your question about niche, maybe it is entirely about differentiation. So 1.3 billion people in China, 4.5 million people here. Even if you have large European suppliers and large US suppliers and large Chinese suppliers, is there going to be a large enough segment of the market which will continually demand the type of product produced by New Zealand because it's grass-fed, because it's pasture-based, because it's whatever? I don't know. It doesn't have to be a huge market segment to satisfy what we can supply into that country.
Because you don't necessarily need to compete at their level, do you? Because we're such a small market, as you say, so there's scale differences between how the businesses operate there and how we operate here, and maybe, as you say, just operating at a smaller capacity is sufficient for our requirements here.
Well, right now, as you know, we export a lot of milk powder. That's not really value adding. That's putting a lot of dairy companies into quite a risky long-term situation. There are people doing clever things. There was a chap I was talking to over in Hawke's Bay. They've got an abattoir over there. They just roboticise the entire thing, so the sheep will come in one end and go out the other end, completely done, not touched by human hands, really limits waste and so forth. They've got niche markets which are very strong for them because of the New Zealand brand and the way they position that. They're actually looking at cryo-freezing whole beast to go to Muslim markets in particular, because they could actually have the beast demonstrably killed and packaged up and sent without being touched in any way, shape or form. Interesting little market niche. So maybe it's more about just continually shifting that focus on what we do here and don't try to compete. But at the moment, for example, what would happen to New Zealand if the dairy sector in China, which is growing rapidly, all of a sudden in the next 2 years turns on the tap 3 times the size of New Zealand? Given the size of the dairy industry here, the average price of milk could get below that magic $6 mark, or $5 mark even, very quickly. That would decimate the sector. People would have to walk off the land. And I don't think they're in a position to change off that base particularly quickly. I don't know if that's going to happen, but there have been enough reports coming out of China saying there's huge investment in intensive dairy in China.
I'm wondering too what might your thoughts be on resilient production on farms, because as you say, if everything's based around dairy production and there's some big change in the overseas market that undercuts that and cuts back on what you can charge out for milk production or milk powder, how can we better create farms that are more diverse and more resilient ecologically, so that they haven't got that environmental footprint, because it's not just one type of farming, but it's more diverse and interconnected farming, and also perhaps adopt better economic marketing structures that are also more diverse and resilient, so that they're not say, easy to undercut because it's not so heavily weighed upon one type of production. It's more diverse.
I guess there's a question there about how diverse are farmers at the moment. I really don't know. So if you were to look at your average farmer, how much diversity is there in their portfolio between milk and sheep and beef and more crops? I imagine quite a few of them have got multiple strings to their bow. So the question may be, what are they doing now and how quickly could they reconfigure what they do to something other? I actually have no idea.
That's a tricky one, that one, I think. And the thing is, the returns get smaller. You become more and more entrenched in what you do. You know, if you're just producing one thing on a farm with a low return, as the margins reduce, you know, you're more and more squeezed and less able to diversify and change what you do on the farm and introduce more complexity and diversity into it.
Like I'm sure most quality farmers will be very aware of that. And they're very aware of the variability. And I'm sure they've got multiple things happening on the property to provide a diversified income base, recognising things go up and down. But we haven't seen a major shock yet. New Zealand managed to avoid the 2008 crash pretty much. Things kind of tweaked, but nothing really changed. There's been 25 years of growth here, a bit more. That's a real anomaly.
And that was just because of the alignment to the Asian markets and the growth in those markets.
Pure luck.
Yeah.
Growth was great. But what happens if the economy, the world economy, which is very visible because it's cyclical, tanks again and trade barriers go up? You know, what type of resilience do we have in the system? I honestly don't know.
Is there any ways to introduce more resiliency, so to help support farmers to create more diversity on the farms? You were talking before about what they do in Europe and the reinvestment back into those farms to reduce the footprint of those farms. Is there, without that access to such a big market and the structure of those businesses to reinvest back into farm production, is there other approaches we can take to help funnel some of the money back into supporting farmers to become more diversified and more long-term resilient in what they do?
Look, I think it may be happening anyway. If you look at the younger farming community, and I should exclude older farmers as well, but the younger farming community are really well educated. They know their business from a business perspective. They understand the international competition and market. So they're not necessarily locked into farming in a particular way. And I think they are scanning their environment quite effectively, looking at what they should do next, how they should adopt technology, even what the long-term financial viability of the current operation is. So I think there's a lot of education and growing sophistication is probably one of the key areas to that. I don't think you'd come across many farmers these days who say, you know, this is how I've done it like that all my life. I think that's a history. I don't think they're like that anymore.
So as the markets change, people tend to adapt to that and adopt new practices as they go. Yeah,
I wrote a report last year or the year before about technology adoption by farmers. And the thing that stood out for me, they would talk about quite radical change within their own industry, almost like it's just another day at the office. So, you know, what would confront other industries as being quite a major shock, they just went, well, you know, we had to make a change, so we did. We spent $500,000 on drone technology, or we changed the way that we market our product, or we invest in a large robotic operation, a whole range of things like that. So I think a lot of it's actually now quite inherent.
And is there ways to be more proactive in that, or is it quite proactive already, rather than being reactive to market changes and trying to adapt business strategies in response to that?
Again, I think the education and sophistication of that community has grown to a point where they're very aware of what's happening in international markets. Well, again, normal curve. You got the group up here are fantastic and they know what's going on and they're moving with it, and the group here tend to be following along, and this group probably will fall off the farming community at some point. The question is, to what extent has that curve moved far enough to the right to make sure that you have enough innovators in the group who are looking for the great ideas that this group can latch onto and follow? I haven't really got a sense for that. I get the feeling it's there, but I also see some big structural challenges for New Zealand, and that's because we're a long way away. It's because of the availability of capital, and it's because of the basic structure of farm ownership and the cooperative model. I think there's going to have to be a major shock to change that at some point.
Thank you. And is there particular things to keep an eye on that might help give them some particularly good guidance as to what some of the emerging trends are and how to think about those trends and what they currently do?
Yeah, again, I think a lot of the farming community do it as a natural course, but because it's such a major market for New Zealand, keep your eye on China. Try to keep. Have you been there often?
No.
Okay. I don't know, 30, 40 times. Know China well. The sheer intensity of change and the way that they can wake up on Monday and say we're going to do that on Friday, and they do it, is phenomenal. Which is why I mentioned the investment into dairy. It's huge over there. The decision 10 years ago to start to reduce pollution in most tier 1 and tier 2 cities meant that you went from visiting there and just seeing rubbish everywhere to not seeing rubbish everywhere within a couple of years. It's quite phenomenal. And
fast rate of change.
Fast rate of change. Air quality, still garbage compared to here, but phenomenally better than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And it goes on like that. So I think for New Zealand farmers, if that's our major market at this point in time, and of course watching the technology and the practices being developed by the Europeans who seem to do it better than anybody. I don't know why that is.
So maybe keeping an eye on the growth and accelerated change of China and learning from their ability to take on new initiatives quickly, as well as kind of what you can learn from European markets that are more well established, and being able to kind of refine what we currently do and try to learn the best lessons from those different markets.
Yeah, I think so. Interesting 20 years, but they always are.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really nice to talk through it.
Good luck with it.